March 6, 1940. 9 a.m. The skies over Pearl Harbor are clear, the sun blazing down on the Pacific. The hum of propellers cuts through the stillness, a calming sound against the ocean's expanse. Above, a squadron of American bombers makes its way toward Midway Atoll, a seemingly quiet dot on the vast Pacific map. Pilots chat casually over the radio, their voices filled with confidence, arrogance almost. They have no reason to believe that anything could go wrong today. For them, the fight ahead is little more than routine. The American military a devastating blow 6 months earlier. Japan's attack on Pearl Harbor had left the U.S. fleet reeling, its military capabilities temporarily crippled. But now the tide is beginning to turn. The Americans are recovering, reorganizing, and most importantly, learning. They have learned to adapt in ways the Japanese couldn't anticipate. Engineers working day and night in the shadows of war have been instrumental in this effort, devising solutions to a critical flaw in the American military's strategy, the range of their aircraft. On paper, it was simple. American bombers were powerful, capable of devastating strikes, but they lacked the range to make long journeys over vast ocean expanses. The Japanese had always believed that no bomber, no fighter could fly that far. They believed they were safe in the isolation of their homeland, untouched by American fighter escorts on bombing runs. Japan's military planners assumed that they had the upper hand when it came to distance and capability. But engineers like Lieutenant Colonel William A. Mitchell, a quietly determined American officer with the Army Air Corps, were about to prove them wrong. By this point, Mitchell had already conceptualized the idea of using drop tanks, external fuel tanks that could extend the range of American fighters, allowing them to escort bombers into enemy airspace and protect them from the ever-present threat of Japanese interceptors. The plans, developed in conjunction with the engineers at Wright Field and other military designers, had been put into motion. Fighter pilots like Captain Robert L. Scott and Lieutenant James H. Doolittle, rising stars in the American Air Force, had already begun testing new, more fuel-efficient engines, while drop tanks were being integrated into the latest aircraft, including the P-40 Warhawk and the P-38 Lightning. In theory, everything was perfect. The bombers could strike deep into Japanese territory, and the fighters would be able to protect them across the vast distances of the Pacific Ocean. The Japanese, overconfident in their own strategic thinking, had no idea what was coming. They believed the American engineers had overestimated their capabilities, that the P-40 and P-38 with their drop tanks could not possibly reach the targets America intended to hit. The Pacific was simply too wide. Back at Pearl Harbor, as the planes rev up their engines on the runway, there's a palpable sense of anticipation. Pilots make last-minute checks on their instruments. The ground crew moves quickly, ensuring the drop tanks are securely attached, ready for the long haul. The mission ahead is critical. The fate of Midway hangs in the balance. The engineers there work at last, seeing the light of day, are confident. This is the moment they've been waiting for. They've solved the Pacific's greatest range problem, or so they think. Little do they know, in the distance far across the water, the Japanese have already begun to suspect something is amiss. Their intelligence isn't perfect, but they have started to notice the increased presence of American fighters, more bombers, more airstrikes. They have underestimated America's determination and innovation, and they are about to pay the price. As the engines roar to life and the planes begin their journey, the confident hum of American air superiority fills the air. The sky is theirs, or so they believe. March 12, 1942. 10:30 a.m. The vast Pacific stretches endlessly below, a dark expanse that swallows any sense of land or refuge. The sun hangs in the sky like an unblinking eye, casting its harsh light on the waves beneath. The American fighters, their drop tanks securely strapped to the wings, slice through the clouds, engines purring with rhythmic precision. The mission is already underway, fighters escorting bombers heading for Midway. But there are murmurs of concern from the intelligence officers on the ground at Pearl Harbor. Japanese reconnaissance planes. Their sleek forms darting across the horizon are often seen almost unnoticed by the American airmen. Yet in the intelligence circles, the Japanese have become increasingly suspicious of the American buildup in the Pacific. The rumblings are there, small at first. Intelligence reports are filed away, but not immediately acted upon. A single report suggests the Japanese might have already adjusted their plans, aware that American bombers, once unable to strike Japan's home islands, are now reaching farther into the Pacific. But such reports are easily dismissed, written off as exaggerations. In Tokyo, the Imperial Japanese Navy is still under the impression that the American aircraft cannot penetrate the defenses of their empire. Their ships are safe. They believe their islands too distant for any real threat. A false sense of security builds within the ranks. The idea of a successful American raid on the Japanese mainland seems absurd, impossible. The Pacific is too wide, too remote, and the range of their aircraft is too limited. Japan's air superiority is unquestioned, and their pilots, highly trained, remain confident. They believe they hold the upper hand. Back at Pearl Harbor, the American military is coming to terms with the aftermath of December 7th. Though morale has been shaken, it's not broken. The engineers, pilots, and commanders now stand in the shadow of a new, perhaps misguided confidence. They have a weapon, they believe a weapon that will change the course of the war. The drop tanks, the new engines, the improved aircraft, it all adds up to a new strategy that will secure victory. But something is slipping through the cracks. In their haste to press forward, the Americans fail to see the full scope of the Japanese threat. Despite the warnings from intelligence officers, despite the increasing signs of Japanese vigilance, there's a dangerous undercurrent of dismissal among the American command. They are too eager, too wrapped up in the perceived superiority of their new technology. They believe the Japanese cannot possibly adapt in time to counter their innovations. The Americans are so focused on proving their new capabilities that they overlook one critical flaw, an underestimation of their enemy's ability to innovate. The drop tanks and the engine upgrades are just one part of the equation. They've failed to account for the human element, the unknown variables of combat. The Japanese, though initially surprised by the increase in American air power, are not without their own countermeasures and their own resolve. And so, while the planes cruise over the Pacific full of hope and self-assurance, the seeds of doubt are already being sown within the Japanese command. It's not yet a crisis, but it will soon be too late to correct the course. The Americans have made their assumptions, their confidence in their engineering innovation clouding their judgment. The tension between overconfidence and underestimation is brewing on both sides. The Americans are certain they've cracked the code. The Japanese are confident that nothing could surprise them. What neither side knows, however, is that these assumptions are about to clash in a way neither is prepared for. March 17, 1942, 11:45 a.m. The hum of the American fighters grows louder as they make their approach toward Midway. The island lies ahead, a key strategic outpost in the Pacific, its importance only growing with each passing day. The bombers are secure in their escort, their presence above the horizon a reassurance to the pilots below. For the Americans, everything seems to be going according to plan. Yet miles to the north, over the vast expanse of the Pacific, the first cracks in their strategy are starting to form. Unknown to the American forces, Japanese long-range bombers are already flying in the opposite direction toward the same patch of ocean. Their objective is unclear at first, but their presence is undeniable. These aircraft are not the typical interceptors. They are something more. They carry larger payloads, and their range exceeds anything the Americans have faced before. They had heard the reports dismissed them as insignificant, but now the proof is in the air. The first wave of unexpected Japanese aircraft cuts through the clouds, their sleek forms casting long shadows over the Pacific. The surprise is not immediate, but there is an unease among the American pilots when they receive their orders to engage. They had been told that the Japanese would not attempt to extend their reach in the way the Americans had yet. Here they are. The Americans had been so certain that the drop tanks and their new engines were the key to the fight, and now, with a sudden burst of realization, they see that the Japanese have begun to answer in kind. Their own bombers, too, are operating at previously unimagined ranges. It is the first true test of the Americans' assumptions. The early contact is a moment of confusion. The Japanese pilots are skilled, well-trained, and their aircraft are formidable. The American fighters, now tasked with protecting the bombers at all costs, find themselves in an unfamiliar situation. They had been prepared for the conventional approach, the usual distances, the familiar dogfights at familiar ranges. But the Japanese aircraft are pushing the limits, their presence further than expected, their range seemingly greater than anticipated. The Americans are forced to adjust, to rethink their tactics mid-air. The margin of error, once wide, is narrowing rapidly. Back at Pearl Harbor, military planners scramble for answers. Reports begin to flood in, contradicting everything the engineers and pilots had come to believe. The bombers are still flying, but the balance is tipping. The Japanese are not adhering to the unwritten rules of distance that the Americans had come to rely upon. Something is wrong, but no one is sure what it is just yet. For the moment, the damage remains invisible, but the seed of doubt is planted. The Japanese have entered the fray in a way no one could have imagined. The arrogance of the American belief that distance was their ally begins to crack. On the American side, the tension mounts as the first engagement begins. Radio chatter crackles, filled with the sound of orders being issued and reports of the engagement's chaos. Pilots exchange words of confusion as they try to reorient themselves in the midst of this unexpected challenge. The clear skies are now filled with the roar of engines, the bark of machine guns, and the frantic shouts of pilots adjusting to a new reality. The drop tanks that were meant to give them an edge are now their greatest disadvantage. Their full tanks of fuel, once a symbol of strategic superiority, make them slower, more vulnerable. For the Japanese pilots, however, the situation is different. They are calm, disciplined, and prepared. They've seen this before, American bombers escorted by fighter aircraft attempting long-range missions. But unlike the Americans, they had anticipated the possibility of this exact scenario. Their aircraft are equipped with additional fuel tanks, the same concept that the Americans had hoped would revolutionize their approach. And they had their own more efficient engines, ones that would allow them to take the fight farther than the Americans thought possible. The Americans, in their arrogance, had underestimated their adversaries. What they had failed to see was that the Japanese were learning, adapting, and evolving at the same rate. In the sky above Midway, the reality of the Pacific War begins to shift. The unexpected challenge from the Japanese forces catches the American pilots off guard, forcing them to fight not only for control of the skies, but for their place in the ever-expanding theater of the war. The vast distances that once seemed so decisive are now a double-edged sword, and the tension that was once a distant problem now feels immediate, urgent. As the first skirmishes unfold, the American engineers and military planners back at Pearl Harbor are faced with an undeniable truth. Their assumptions, the core of their strategy, have been shattered. The fight is far from over, but it has already changed. The balance of power is no longer as certain as it once was. The Pacific may still be vast, but the limits of American aircraft have already been stretched beyond their original expectations. March 20th, 1942, 2:30 p.m. The sun beats down relentless in its intensity. On the horizon, the shimmering expanse of the Pacific stretches out like an endless canvas. The American fighters, now fully engaged in combat, soar through the sky, their drop tanks adding extra weight, but also the promise of extended range. The bombers, once confident in their protection, now find themselves facing a greater threat than anticipated. They were supposed to be the hunters, but now they are the hunted. The Japanese, after their first unexpected strike, have regrouped. They are not dismayed by the initial setbacks. Instead, they adapt as if the skies belong to them, and their pilots have come to accept the inherent risk of combat. In the distance, more Japanese aircraft appear flying in tighter formations, their engines humming with a precise, almost mechanical rhythm. The Americans, caught off guard by the ability of the Japanese to extend their reach, are scrambling to adjust. The distance which they once thought to be their greatest advantage now seems to be their greatest vulnerability. The situation is rapidly escalating. The American pilots, who had been so sure of their technological advantage, are beginning to feel the pressure. Their fighter escorts, once meant to be a shield, are now finding themselves increasingly unable to keep up. The drop tanks, which had been hailed as a solution, are now making the aircraft sluggish and less maneuverable in dogfights. As the Japanese forces tighten their grip, the American fighters are forced to make difficult decisions. Do they continue to protect the bombers even as their own positions become more precarious? Or do they break off and fight the enemy aircraft in a desperate attempt to regain control of the sky? Back at Pearl Harbor, the American commanders are growing more anxious with each passing hour. The reports of Japanese aircraft extending their range farther than expected are now more than just isolated incidents. The misjudgment made by the American engineers, who had assumed the Pacific was too vast for the Japanese to strike back effectively, is now painfully clear. The Japanese have not only matched the American range, but have done so with far greater efficiency and deadly intent. This is a new type of warfare, one where distance is no longer the enemy, but rather the key to dominance. In Tokyo, the High Command of the Imperial Japanese Navy watches the unfolding events with a mixture of calculated calm and rising pride. They had anticipated the possibility of American innovation, but they had not fully understood the scale of it. However, their strategic vision has already accounted for such developments. Japan's superiority in the skies is not just a matter of numbers. It's a matter of willpower. They have the better pilots, the better tactics, and now they have the range to follow their enemies across the vast expanse of the Pacific. As the battle continues to unfold, the American pilots realize they are not just fighting for superiority in the skies, they are fighting to prove that the Pacific's distances truly matter. The myth of invulnerability is beginning to crack, and the reality of the Pacific's vastness is beginning to sink in. The Japanese forces, though taken aback by the American resolve, are not going to simply retreat. They are pushing back with a vengeance, showing no signs of slowing. The misjudgment that has led to this escalating conflict is beginning to take its toll. The engineers who had believed that their technology could outpace the Japanese ability to adapt are now questioning their assumptions. What had once seemed like an airtight plan is now full of holes. The range problem was never just about fuel, it was about understanding the limits of their own aircraft and the ingenuity of their enemies. In the skies above the Pacific, the fight has become a test of endurance. The American pilots, once certain of their advantage, now face the full weight of their miscalculation. The Japanese, with their new tactics and aircraft, continue to push the Americans to their limits. The once clear path to victory is now clouded with uncertainty, and the engineer's vision of a quick and decisive victory begins to crumble. The struggle for air superiority is no longer just about technology, it is about who can outthink and outlast the other. The American engineers, once confident in their designs, are now forced to confront the possibility that their assumptions were flawed from the start. March 25th, 1942. 4 p.m. The Pacific remains as vast as ever, an ocean of endless blue stretching out beneath the sky. The battle above, however, is anything but endless. Every second feels like an eternity as the American fighters and bombers, struggling against mounting odds, continue to face the relentless tide of Japanese air superiority. The drop tanks that were supposed to give them the edge now feel like anchors, holding the pilots back, weighing them down in the face of an ever-evolving enemy. The distance they had once believed to be a critical advantage now seems to be the very thing that keeps them from victory. The first signs of the turning point appear slowly, then suddenly, a missed shot. A bomber left vulnerable. A fighter escort pulled too far from the action. The Americans begin to realize that despite their technological innovations, the Japanese have managed to outpace them in a way that no one expected. The Japanese pilots, flying with greater precision and skill, are able to target bombers with deadly accuracy, taking out one after another with a coordinated effort that forces the American pilots into retreat. On the ground, military commanders exchange tense words. The reports from the sky are dismal. The American pilots, despite their best efforts, are being overwhelmed. The range that had once seemed like an advantage is now the problem. The extended fuel tanks, meant to allow the bombers to reach farther distances, have stretched the American fighters too thin. The fighter escorts, now unable to sustain themselves for long enough to provide adequate protection, are falling behind as their own fuel tanks dwindle. What was meant to be a grand advantage is now a glaring weakness. Back in Tokyo, the Japanese High Command observes the situation with cautious optimism. They had anticipated this moment. They had known that the Americans would eventually reach out across the Pacific, attempting to strike at the heart of their empire. But they also knew that such an attempt would expose the weaknesses in American strategy. They had adapted their own aircraft and tactics, ensuring that their pilots could not only meet the challenge, but exceed it. The Japanese had their own advanced engines, their own extended fuel tanks, and the kind of skillful execution that the Americans had failed to anticipate. The Pacific was vast, but now the Japanese pilots controlled the skies above it, picking off American bombers and fighters with increasing precision. For the American pilots, the realization comes slowly but with undeniable force. They are not equipped for this kind of fight. They have underestimated the enemy. The fight is no longer about technological superiority, it's about knowing how to use that technology in the heat of battle. The Japanese, though perhaps initially caught off guard by the presence of American bombers, have now come to dominate the skies in ways that the Americans could not have predicted. Their aircraft are flying farther, their tactics are more precise, and their resolve is stronger than the Americans had given them credit for. On the ground, the engineers and military planners begin to understand the gravity of the situation. The solutions they had so carefully crafted, drop tanks, better engines. New fighter designs have not proven to be the miracle they had hoped for. Instead, they are realizing that no amount of technological advancement can overcome the human element. The unpredictability of war, the ability of the enemy to adapt, and the misjudgment of assuming that distance alone could decide the outcome of the conflict. As the battle rages on, the American forces come to a hard truth. The edge they believed they had has all but vanished. The Japanese forces have adapted faster and more efficiently than they ever could have imagined. The battle for control of the Pacific is now a brutal, bloody fight for survival. And the Americans, despite all their innovation and determination, are beginning to see the limits of their engineering triumphs. The turning point is undeniable, but no one wants to admit it yet. The Americans have been humbled in the skies above the Pacific, their assumptions shattered. The Japanese, though they have yet to achieve final victory, are beginning to feel the weight of their own triumph. The war has shifted in ways that no one expected, and the stakes are higher than ever. March 30th, 1942. 6 p.m. The fading light of the Pacific sun casts long shadows over the ocean. The sky, once so wide and promising, now feels like a deadly trap. American aircraft, their drop tanks drained of fuel, circle aimlessly in the sky, unable to continue their mission. The bombers, vulnerable without their escorts, are slowly being picked off by the Japanese forces. Each loss a blow to the already fragile American resolve. What had started as a bold venture, a technological innovation to win the war, has now turned into a desperate scramble for survival. In the cockpit of this American fighter planes, the mood is a mix of shock and disbelief. Pilots who only hours before had been confident in their technological edge are now facing the harsh reality that their assumptions about the Pacific have been completely wrong. The extended ranges of their aircraft have made them slow, vulnerable, and exposed. The drop tanks, once hailed as the solution to the greatest problem facing the American military, are now a heavy burden. Fuel levels are dangerously low, and there is no way to sustain the fight much longer. The Japanese, once thought to be out of range, are closing in from all sides, their superior maneuverability and precision proving to be decisive. On the ground, chaos erupts. The engineers who had worked tirelessly to create the breakthrough that was supposed to turn the tide of the war are left in stunned silence as they process the reports flooding in from the front lines. The drop tanks were supposed to allow American fighters to escort bombers across the Pacific, to turn the vast distances of the ocean into an asset rather than a liability. Instead, those same distances have exposed the vulnerability of the American forces, and the Japanese are seizing upon that weakness. The Japanese pilots, trained in the art of long-range combat and backed by aircraft capable of matching the Americans' range, are proving themselves more than capable of holding their own. The shock of the situation is palpable. How could the American forces have misjudged the Japanese so badly? How could they have been so certain that their technological advancements would solve a problem that in reality had more to do with strategy tactics and the unpredictability of warfare than mere engineering? The drop tanks, while innovative, had created an unintended consequence. The American planes were too heavy, too slow, and too vulnerable in the face of a nimble and well-prepared enemy. In the high command at Pearl Harbor, the mood is one of confusion and panic. The reports that had once seemed to promise a solution are now a reminder of the perils of overconfidence. There is no simple fix, no quick remedy for the problem at hand. The engineers who had believed they were solving the greatest challenge of the Pacific War are now scrambling for answers. But the enemy has already adapted, and the Americans find themselves chasing shadows, trying to recover ground that was lost before they even knew the fight had begun. Desperate decisions are being made in real time. Orders are given to abandon the original strategy, to bring the bombers back and rethink the plan for future engagements. The American forces, already stretched thin by the demands of the war, are now forced to make a painful decision, adapt quickly, or risk losing everything. The drop tanks, which were once a symbol of American ingenuity, are now seen as an albatross around their necks. The weight of their failure begins to set in. Engineers and pilots alike are left grappling with the fact that they had placed their faith in a technological solution that was ultimately flawed. But even as the Americans struggle to regain their footing, the Japanese are not slowing down. They are taking advantage of every opening, exploiting every mistake the Americans make. The shock of the American forces is matched by the calm efficiency of the Japanese. Their pilots, their engineers, their high command, each is operating with a level of coordination and precision that the Americans had underestimated. The Japanese have been forced into a defensive position at the start of the war, but now, with each passing day, they are gaining ground. As the American fighters retreat, the feeling of helplessness grows. The loss of bombers, the defeat of the fighter escorts, the failed technological solution, all weigh heavily on the minds of the pilots who are still in the air. They know that they have failed, that the innovation they had trusted has not held up under the harsh realities of combat. Their enemies, once assumed to be inferior, have turned the tide of the war. The Pacific, which seemed so vast and full of potential, now feels like a trap. The ocean that once protected them is now the very thing that isolates them from their allies and supplies. Back on the ground, military strategists and engineers are left to question everything. Was this the price of overconfidence? Had they underestimated the ingenuity of the Japanese forces? Was this defeat inevitable from the moment they decided that range alone would be their ticket to victory? The answers will come too late, but the questions will remain echoing through the halls of command for the rest of the war. April 2nd, 1942. 7:15 a.m. The first rays of sunlight break across the horizon, casting an orange glow over the still expanse of the Pacific. But for those involved in the fight above, the sky is no longer a place of hope or opportunity. It is a battlefield of frustration and failure. American fighters, their fuel reserves dangerously low, return to base, one by one, their missions incomplete. The bombers, once protected by a shield of air superiority, are now in tatters. Their pilots return with grim faces, knowing that the mission they had been tasked with is lost. What had begun as a bold technological breakthrough has now spiraled into an operational disaster. The American engineers who had worked tirelessly to develop the drop tanks and improve the aircraft's range are now forced to confront the harsh truth: their solution was never going to work. The drop tanks, which had been intended to extend the reach of the American fighters, have instead created a deadly vulnerability. The planes are slower, less agile, and are too exposed. The strategic advantage they had envisioned is nowhere to be found. In the heat of battle, it becomes clear the Pacific is not just a test of technology, it is a test of adaptation, of human resilience, and of the ability to anticipate the unpredictable. In the command rooms at Pearl Harbor, military planners are re-evaluating their entire strategy. The drop tanks, once seen as a game changer, are now regarded with skepticism. Reports flood in each one, telling the same story: the Japanese have already adapted to the new American tactics. Their fighters, despite being outnumbered, have proven to be faster, more maneuverable and better equipped for the long-range engagements that the Americans had hoped to dominate. The technological superiority that the Americans had once counted on has been nullified not by sheer force, but by the Japanese willingness to innovate and adapt in real time. The collapse of the original plan begins to set in with full force. The American fighters, despite their extended range, can no longer keep up with the rapidly shifting dynamics of the battle. The bombers, once considered invulnerable when escorted by fighter aircraft, are now falling prey to the superior Japanese forces. The sheer distance of the Pacific, which had once been an obstacle for the Japanese, is now working against the Americans. The drop tanks, which were supposed to turn distance into a weapon, have become the Americans' greatest liability. There is no quick fix. The American military finds itself at a crossroads, forced to confront the reality that their technological assumptions have been shattered. The engineers who had believed they had solved the greatest problem of the war are now desperately trying to find a solution. But the challenge is not just technical, it is strategic. The Japanese are not only capable of matching the Americans' range, but they are also able to leverage it in ways the Americans had never considered. The battle is no longer about range. It is about who can adapt faster, who can learn from the mistakes of the past. The engineers and military planners, now working in the aftermath of failure, begin to reassess their approach. They had built the drop tanks with one goal in mind: to extend the range of American fighters so that they could escort bombers across the Pacific. But in doing so, they had created a new problem, a problem that was now beyond their immediate control. The bombers, once the centerpiece of the American strategy, are now sitting ducks in the vastness of the Pacific. The once innovative designs are now exposed as deeply flawed. The Japanese, meanwhile, continue to push forward, their momentum growing with each passing day. Their adaptability, their ability to turn the tide of battle quickly, has proven to be their greatest strength. The Americans, once so confident in their ability to outpace the Japanese through technological superiority, are now scrambling to keep up. The cost of their failure is beginning to sink in. Every lost bomber, every downed fighter represents a piece of the American military's hope for victory slipping away. Back at Pearl Harbor, as the reality of the collapse of the original plan sets in, the sense of disbelief lingers. The engineers, military leaders, and pilots who had once believed in their technological edge are now forced to acknowledge that they have been outplayed. The battlefield has shifted, and the distance that had once seemed like the key to victory is now the reason for their defeat. The lessons of the past few weeks are hard ones, and they will not be easily forgotten. The American military now faces the harsh reality that their assumptions were flawed and their strategy was built on a foundation that was too weak to survive the pressure of real combat. The Pacific, vast and unforgiving, has proven to be a much more complex battlefield than they had imagined. April 7th, 1942, 9 a.m. The morning fog hangs heavy over the Pacific, the soft hum of aircraft engines breaking the silence. Above the clouds, a new sense of urgency fills the air as the American forces regroup, shaken but not yet broken. The failure of the drop tanks and their extended range has left the American military reeling, but it has not completely derailed their resolve. The officers, engineers, and pilots are determined to salvage what they can from the wreckage of their original plan. There's a new clarity in their eyes, a recognition that the war is no longer about technological superiority, but about adaptation, about learning from mistakes. Back at Pearl Harbor, the engineering teams are working around the clock to come up with a new solution. The drop tanks, it seems, are not the answer. They had been a clever attempt to solve a critical problem, but they had failed in practice. Now the engineers are racing against time to develop a more effective strategy, one that doesn't rely on the same assumptions that led to their earlier failure. They know the Pacific is vast, and they know that their aircraft need to be faster, more maneuverable, and more adaptable to the long-range missions that are becoming the new norm. But this time they are approaching the problem from a different angle. They no longer trust the simple idea that range alone can solve everything. The shift in strategy comes in the form of a new approach to aircraft design, focusing on speed and maneuverability over sheer range. While the drop tanks had been an attempt to extend the range of American fighters, the new focus is on refining the aircraft's engines and reducing weight. The engineers begin to experiment with new technologies, better aerodynamics, and lighter materials, pushing the limits of what's possible. They also begin to focus on improving coordination between the fighter escorts and bombers, understanding that the key to survival is not just technology, but tactical precision. But the Japanese are not standing still. They too are improving their aircraft, their engines, and their tactics. The intelligence coming in from the front lines shows that the Japanese are fully aware of the American attempts to innovate, and they are adapting just as quickly. The advantage that the Americans had once hoped for is now slipping away, and every new aircraft or modification is met with a countermeasure from the Japanese. The race to dominate the skies over the Pacific is no longer one of technological breakthroughs. It is a battle of attrition, of adaptation, and of survival. In the air, the pilots continue to face the grim reality of the previous months. The bombers that had once been thought to be invulnerable, protected by their fighter escorts, are now more vulnerable than ever. The escorts, despite their new range, still struggle to keep up. The drop tanks in the end had only bought them time, but time is something they are running out of. Every mission that ends in failure is a reminder of how deeply flawed their strategy had been. The confusion of the earlier days is replaced with a quiet desperation. The Americans are no longer fighting with the same arrogance they once had. They now understand the full scope of the war they are engaged in. It's not just a matter of technological superiority, but of resourcefulness and the ability to adapt under pressure. They are learning from their mistakes, but the cost is high. In Tokyo, the Japanese continue to press their advantage, consolidating their gains and refining their own strategies. They know that the Americans will not give up easily, but they also know that the Americans have been forced to react. The balance of power is shifting, and the Japanese are determined to maintain their lead. Back at Pearl Harbor, there is a sense of resolve, but also a recognition that the mistakes of the past cannot be undone. The American forces must continue to move forward, adapting to the changing dynamics of the Pacific. They are learning the hard way that victory cannot be assured through technology alone. It is the human element, the ability to think on your feet, to learn and to adapt, that will ultimately decide the outcome of this conflict. For the engineers, the task ahead is clear. They must come up with new solutions, new designs, and new tactics, but they are no longer driven by the blind faith in technological innovation. They know that their earlier assumptions were flawed, and they are determined not to repeat the same mistakes. The war has changed, and the Americans are learning how to fight it on the terms of the Pacific, vast, unpredictable, and unforgiving. April 15th, 1942, 3:30 p.m. The Pacific, ever vast and unforgiving, seems to stretch farther than ever as American aircraft soar over it. The sky has lost its romanticism. It is now a battleground, and with each passing moment, the stakes grow higher. In the cockpit, pilots can feel the weight of the realization that had been creeping into their minds for weeks. They had misjudged the Pacific's vastness, underestimated the adaptability of their enemies, and now, despite their best efforts, they are paying the price. The once promising innovation of the drop tanks, which had seemed like the key to victory, now lies in ruins. The distance that had been their advantage is no longer theirs to claim. The Japanese, having adapted with a speed and precision that caught the Americans off guard, are now fighting back in a way that feels impossible to counter. On the ground, the military planners and engineers are grappling with the same truth. The new aircraft designs, meant to replace the failed drop tanks, are still in the early stages of development. The shift towards speed and maneuverability over range has not yet provided a definitive solution. The engineers, who had once felt so certain that their technological advances would turn the tide, now face the harsh realization that no single innovation will win the war. The Japanese, with their own engineering brilliance, have proven that the key to victory is not just about who has the superior technology, but who can outthink and outlast their opponent. As the skies above the Pacific darken, the moment of realization settles in like a heavy fog. The Americans are no longer fighting just for control of the air. They are fighting for survival. The earlier sense of invincibility fueled by technological advancements has evaporated. The drop tanks were supposed to be the game changer, the edge that tipped the scales in America's favor. Instead, they had become the symbol of misjudgment, of overconfidence, and of an underestimation of the enemy's ability to adapt. Back in Tokyo, the Japanese High Command watches the unfolding events with growing confidence. They knew that the Americans would fight back with innovation, but they also knew that such innovation could not match the resourcefulness of the Japanese pilots and engineers. The Japanese military had anticipated the Americans' moves, and they had been ready for them. The success of their own aircraft and strategies had been built not just on superior technology, but on an understanding of the Pacific theater that the Americans had lacked. Distance had been a barrier to both sides, but the Japanese had learned how to use it to their advantage. For the American pilots, the realization is clear as they see their own numbers dwindling and their mission objectives unmet. They had flown into this battle believing they were prepared for anything, only to find themselves on the receiving end of an enemy that had been just as prepared. The once clear skies of victory are now clouded with uncertainty, and each lost plane represents another piece of American confidence shattered. The moment of realization is not a single instant. It is a slow, grinding acknowledgement of the war's true nature. It is the understanding that technological superiority alone will not win the day, that there is no quick solution to the complexities of the Pacific conflict. The Americans had believed they could dominate with innovation, but the Japanese had taught them that war is not a contest of gadgets, it is a contest of wills, of strategy, and of adaptability. For the engineers back at Pearl Harbor, the weight of this realization is even heavier. They had believed in their designs, their technologies, and the promise of progress. But as the American forces regroup and reassess, they understand that no single weapon or system will ensure victory. The true lesson of the Pacific War is the importance of flexibility, of learning from failure, and of never underestimating the enemy's ability to adapt. The battle is far from over, but the Americans now see the war for what it truly is. A struggle not just of arms, but of minds. The distance that once seemed so daunting is now simply a backdrop to a larger, more unpredictable conflict. The engineers who had placed their faith in technology are now coming to terms with the fact that innovation, while important, is not the key to winning. What matters most is the ability to outmaneuver, to think faster, and to adjust to the ever-shifting realities of the Pacific theater. The moment of realization is sobering. The game has changed, and the Americans, now fully aware of the limits of their earlier assumptions, must find a new way to fight or risk losing everything. April 20th, 1942. 5:00 p.m. The Pacific sky stretches endlessly above, yet it feels smaller now, like a cage that has closed in on the American forces. The battle has taken its toll, and the consequences are clear. The American forces, who once held the belief that their technological innovations would carry them through the war, are now faced with a sobering reality. The drop tanks, meant to be the answer to the vast expanse of the Pacific, have only exposed the weaknesses in their strategy. What was supposed to be a breakthrough has turned into a costly misstep, and the price of that mistake is becoming painfully evident. The Japanese, with their ability to adapt and their mastery of the skies, have taken control. Their pilots, more experienced and better equipped to handle the long-range engagements, have proven themselves superior in this new kind of warfare. The American forces, despite their technological edge, are no match for the speed and precision of their enemies. The distance which had once seemed like the enemy has become the Japanese advantage as they continue to outmaneuver the Americans at every turn. Back at Pearl Harbor, the military leaders and engineers are left to pick up the pieces. The drop tanks, once seen as the key to turning the tide of the war, are now a symbol of failure. The engineers who had poured countless hours into developing the technology are now grappling with the painful truth that their efforts, no matter how innovative, were not enough. The Americans had underestimated the complexity of the war in the Pacific. They had assumed that technological innovation could solve all their problems, but they had failed to understand the deeper dynamics at play, the need for adaptability, for human ingenuity, and for a strategy that could withstand the unpredictable nature of the conflict. The pilots returning from their missions carry with them the weight of the loss. The sky that once felt like a place of freedom is now a battlefield that has taken far too much from them. The American fighters, once seen as the future of the war, are now retreating their range, not the advantage they had hoped for, but a source of vulnerability. The bombers, left exposed without their escorts, are falling victim to the relentless Japanese assault. The Americans have been caught off guard, and the results are devastating. As the months pass, the realization of what has been lost becomes even clearer. The war is not just a matter of technology, but of human resolve. The American military, despite its best efforts, has not been able to outthink or outmaneuver the Japanese. The once shining promise of technological superiority has been shattered, and the Americans are left with a deep understanding that no amount of innovation can replace the need for flexibility, for quick thinking, and for a willingness to learn from mistakes. The consequences of this failure will be felt throughout the rest of the war. The American forces will have to rebuild, reassess, and adapt in ways they never anticipated. The lessons of the drop tanks and of the overconfidence that led to their use will stay with them for the duration of the conflict. The Pacific will continue to be a battleground, but the nature of that fight has changed. The distance that once seemed to separate the enemies has become a tool for the Japanese, one that the Americans must learn to navigate if they hope to have any chance of success. The lesson, though learned too late, is undeniable. The Pacific War is not one that can be won by technology alone. It is a war that demands flexibility, resilience, and the ability to adapt in the face of an ever-changing enemy. The Americans may have been caught off guard by the Japanese ability to adapt, but they will not make the same mistake again. The road to victory will be long, and the cost of the war will continue to rise. But the Pacific will be won not through superior technology, but through the ability to learn to grow and to change with the tides of the conflict.